I'll try not to touch it.
I know how that goes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It is 6 a.m. here in Chicago, where I'm based, and I'm excited to welcome to you the first keynote of the day for us in the U.S. We have 4 of them coming up today. Valerie Lewis from Ireland is going to be joining us, and I'm very excited to have her here. Particularly because we're going to be talking about sustainability in schools, and that's something here in the United States we need to be working on a lot more. And I think Valerie has some great experiences that she'll share with us. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her, and then I'm going to turn it over to her. And I'm so thankful to have her here. So let me pull up my little spiel, and we'll get started. And hopefully I'm going to read this at a speed that is not too fast. So imagine walking into a school where sustainability isn't just a unit in a science class. It's woven through math, history, language arts, PE, every single subject, where every student in every class understands their role in building a sustainable future. That's not just a nice idea. That's exactly what Valerie Lewis is making happen in Irish schools right now. Valerie is the director of the Take One program, a Department of Education funded initiative helping schools embed education for sustainable development across their entire curriculum. She works with the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework and carries a powerful motto that every student, every subject, every class. What makes Valerie's approach so powerful and so relevant to GLOW is that she's thinking systematically. She's not asking individual teachers to save the world alone. She's reimagining what it means for schools to function as whole communities committed to sustainable futures. She's also pursuing her own Doctor of Education in Sustainable Futures, walking the walk alongside the educators she supports. If you are passionate about sustainability and education for the planet, and one of GLOW's core themes, her keynote today will give you a concrete replicable model you can bring back to your own school community. So without further ado, please welcome Valerie Lewis. Thanks, Valerie, for being here.
Thank you, Lucy. That's great. I couldn't have put that better myself. I might steal that from my blog. That
Sure,
really wrapped everything up really well. It's great and lovely to hear somebody else's perspective on the work we do from the outside in. Thank you very much. And as Lucy said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I know people are joining us from various time zones. For those of you who have got up early and those of you who are watching the clock to head to your beds, thank you very much for joining me here this morning. And thank you very much to Lucy and the GLOW team for providing me with this opportunity to share the work of the Take One program and sustainable development as it is in Ireland at the moment. So obviously a little bit of housekeeping. The sessions are recorded, and just a little word from the sponsors there for this great GLOW event and all that happens at it. So as Lucy mentioned, I'm going to speak to you a bit about the Take One program, how it came about, my role in it, my thinking behind it. And I'm going to, I suppose, divide the session into 2 parts, because I would like to set the scene for you in terms of Ireland and that systems piece that Lucy spoke about and what it looks like and how I came to this work. I'm a post-primary teacher by profession, but a number of years ago had an opportunity to work on secondment in our Department of Foreign Affairs. And while there, fortuitously, Ireland and Kenya were the facilitators of the negotiations for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as an educator, to see that happen at a distance, I certainly wasn't involved at the coalface, but educators don't tend to be that close to policy development. And it was quite interesting to watch it unfold. It was also quite interesting to watch the impact that a small country like Ireland and Kenya had in terms of bringing 193 nations together and what that looked like. and mapping out a plan for the next 15 years and how that would work and all that it entailed. And I meandered back into formal education in a policy role and did that thing that other teachers hate. I said to them, I think we need to be doing something about this, and it very much aligns with the aspirations of education. But I was also conscious of, as an educator and school leader, that infamous line, when society gets an itch, education must scratch it. And I certainly didn't want to be the kind of educator and facilitator and program designer who came with more work for teachers. I'm sure in countries around the world, curriculums are already fairly comprehensively packed as they are in Ireland. So I began to spend some time looking at, if I did want to present something, what would that look like for our educators? And that is how the Take One program was born. It was very much looking at that systems piece. What do we have to do? And how could sustainable development engage with what is there already? And as luck would have it, our lower second level, so the curriculum between the ages of 12 and 15 had just been repurposed. So I was able to do a lot of work mapping in relation to there. So just for as I said, the first part of the session, I'm going to talk a little bit about that system and about the landscape in Ireland, because I think it's relevant to look at what I was working with in terms of development and what informed me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what ESD is in the context of Ireland, not because anybody needs sustainability explained to them, but it is a place I start with all the educators and leaders, because in this sea of language aligned to sustainability, it can be very easy to assume we all have the same understanding. And while I'm not looking for an agreed understanding, I am presenting the lens through which our curriculum documents, our subject syllabuses, and our education and government departments look. I'm going to talk a little bit about policy alignment. And again, it's more for setting the scene rather than trying to confuse people by what happens in Ireland. And all of the documents I reference will be linked in the later slides. So if you do feel the need to have a look at how things are set up, there will be a link there. And my contact details are on one of the final slides, but they're across the bottom of all these slides as well. Then the meat, I think, on the bones would be the Take One program itself, what that looks like, what was born out of all those experiences, and a very brief example of learning in action. And I'd like to leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions if anybody has those. So in Ireland, we're quite a small country. So there are 723 second level schools in the country. Currently, the Take One program has been applied or utilised in over half of those. And we do have a national curriculum, so it's prescribed. This is useful for me because it means whatever school I speak to, whether it's a state school or a religious run school or a private school, the curriculum is a framework for those. It's prescribed in that there are stepping stones, but there is some local autonomy in terms of the subject syllabuses that are used and what that looks like. In our national ESD strategy documents and in our education documents, the definition that we mostly align to is that comes under Target 4.7 from the Sustainable Development Goals. I find this really useful when I'm talking to educators, mostly because when I mention, and I know it happens with colleagues and probably internationally, when I mention the word sustainable development, we tend to default to climate and environment. And I am never going to say that the climate and environment issues aren't relevant and important. But what I will say is I personally feel as an educator that they can close down the conversation on sustainable development because they're urgent, because there's emergency, because we talk about crisis. And while people nod sagely and tell me these things are important, I find that the aspiration doesn't translate into action. Using the definition from 4.7 is important for a number of reasons. Number one, it's what's listed in curriculum documents. So I'm saying to teachers, I'm not bringing some new information to you. But what's really pivotal for me is looking at the language aligned to 4.7, and I've highlighted some of those items there. Things like human rights, equality, diversity, culture of peace, culture in particular, culture's contribution to sustainable development. And why I find that helpful is a lot of our schools have vision and mission statements. They have a particular ethos. And all of those vision and mission statements tend to align more broadly to that piece about global citizenship, about diversity, about equality, about supporting young people to become the best citizens they can. And it allows schools to see from the outset that their ethos, their reason for being, is very much aligned with the core values of sustainable development within itself. So I think that's a really good jumping off point for schools to feel from the outset that this is not something additional and evidences that embedded piece. In 2022, we launched in Ireland our second national strategy on education for sustainable development. And this was quite an unusual strategy document in that 3 government departments came together to develop and launch this document. I see my slide is the IT gremlins have got at it. But the 3 government departments were the Department of Education, the Department of Further Education, and the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. And it was quite unusual at that time to see 3 government departments collaborating in relation to this. And it was really fortuitous and really positive because, again, it highlights that systems thinking piece where we're trying to share the language. And you'll see from the graphic on the right that that document and its aligned implementation plan covers early childhood education, primary education, post-primary, further higher ed, adult, and youth and community. So we have this strategy document that uses language across the education spectrum, but also acknowledges formal, non-formal, and informal learning environments. Looking at the language from international documents, so very much informed by the UNESCO documents, looking at the 5 priority areas that are included in those documents and highlighting things like knowledge, skills, and particularly values. And I think the values piece for me is a real nugget and gem in terms of how we engage with sustainable development. What do I care about? Because we tend to change the things we care about. We impact, we try and progress them. So that values piece has become more and more important. And that's really good to see. So again, when we look at that national document, that ESD strategy, that informs our education policy syllabus document. And that's a document there in the centre. And we call that document Looking at Our School. And our second level schools use that to plan the subjects that their students will engage with. It plans their evaluation process. It plans how they organise their school year, and they're planning for 1, 2, or 3 years. And it also is the document that informs our subject and our school inspections. So again, the Take One programme really looks at these documents because they are set documents and using the language that is in those documents, looking at how they're informed. And again, that systems piece and all of the subjects grow out of that framework document. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a national curriculum and we have subject syllabuses for each of our subjects, which again provide stepping stones for our teachers at a classroom level in terms of what they look like. Really, again, very important in terms of what that planning entails. So that document, that looking at our school, encompasses two broad areas: learning and teaching, and leadership and management. And these are guiding principles for our schools. So we have standards which we encourage our teachers to adhere to. And then we have statements of effective practice. So it helps us to look at how are we achieving those. In that 2022 document, really interestingly, it was primarily kept in its previous iteration, but there were some updates which I was very heartened to see. I'm not sure all of the educators were pleased, but we see a lot of language aligning to sustainable development, both explicitly and implicitly. And I've really, again, I suppose, just picked out two broad examples. There are lots in this document, but I think it was useful to share with you one example from the teaching and learning perspective and one from the leadership and management. And the teaching and learning example I highlight doesn't explicitly mention sustainable development, but it does talk about teachers enabling students to make meaningful links between lesson materials and their learning in other subjects and elsewhere. And I will connect this up when I talk in more detail about the Take One programme, but you can keep that in mind in relation to the importance of looking at that embedding piece, making sense of what we learn, why we learn it, and how it's useful beyond the school environment. In terms of the leadership and management domain, you'll see very explicitly the school values and promotes a commitment to sustainable development, but also moving it beyond just the talk piece or the policy piece and looking at the daily routines of the school. How am I living that diversity? How am I living that inclusivity, that global citizenship piece, and looking at it from a broad perspective? Again, much harder if we only look at sustainable development through the climate lens. And again, I will reiterate, it's not that I don't think climate is important, but once we broaden out how we see the things that impact climate, biodiversity, and environment, it offers our teachers, our leaders, our students much more scope to come at sustainable development from lots of different perspectives, and most importantly, from the perspective that I care about, and gives all of those things equal value. So moving on then to what is the Take One programme and how it was born. As I mentioned, we have a national strategy. I'm very lucky that the Department of Education in Ireland sees the value of the Take One programme. It's been running now for almost 5 years. And as I said, was born very much out of my own experience and the impact seeing the Sustainable Development Goals be developed had on me. I'm very pragmatic in my approach and very aware that the Sustainable Development Goals create tensions, as does sustainable development in itself. They're not ideal for everybody. They create some challenges. But again, with that pragmatic lens, this is where we're at. We're now 4 years away from the next iteration. So it's very much leaning into what is there and how do we make that work? And again, back to that systems piece. A huge part of my remit is to support school leaders, teacher leaders, middle leaders, what we would call in Ireland our principals and our deputy principals or our head teachers. Acknowledging the research that tells us the impact that leaders have on what gets traction in education and the importance of bringing those leaders along. Not again to present them with more work, but to highlight how what they have to do day to day within the school environment is very much aligned to the practices and principles of sustainable development. So again, transforming learning environments. The Take One programme was very much about acknowledging the curriculum overload and the workload. So Take One colloquially and I suppose in a very flippant way is about taking one step. Sometimes taking one breath, taking one piece, taking one SDG, and trying to move away from that overwhelm where teachers may feel, I'm not an expert, I have no interest in learning more about, I've got a curriculum to cover. I've got a prescribed subject syllabus. How on earth do you now expect that I will add this in? It leans into teacher expertise, teacher professionalism, what they know already, leaning into their own subject expertise and highlighting and demonstrating for them where this sits already. It's very easy as a facilitator to throw out that line, you're doing this already. So again, I very much wanted to highlight for teachers that I understood where they were coming from, leaning into my own classroom and leadership experience and providing them, I suppose, in two ways, providing them with the supports and resources they needed, but also taking away barriers that they might perceive would be a difficulty to engage. So what I devised primarily in the Take One program was to sit down with all of those subject syllabuses. And at our lower second level in Ireland, we have approximately 27, 24 full-time, and then we have a well-being program that looks at citizenship and personal experiences as well. Each of our subject syllabuses, as I said, is prescribed. So I'm going to talk you through two examples, but just to say that they are there for all of the subject syllabuses across the lower second level curriculum. The example I've on screen is a modern foreign languages, and each of our subject syllabuses is devised into strands with a set of learning outcomes. And these are learning outcomes that those teachers must cover in course content. So in the spirit of looking at the must-haves, I spent quite a lot of time in the first year of devising the Take One program in mapping those learning outcomes back to the Sustainable Development Goals and vice versa. Where were the Sustainable Development Goals implicitly or explicitly referenced in subject syllabuses that teachers had to do? The idea behind this was I suppose, threefold. One was to provide that resource for those teachers. Two was to highlight that it was their subject expertise that was really important. But most importantly, and Lucy mentioned it from the outset, that every student, every subject, every class mantra, it's really important to me that we bring all teachers on board. So moving away from those teachers that we consider have the expertise in climate or that it's part of their subject remit, and saying to every teacher, this is something that you have an opportunity to engage with as a streamlined piece of the learning within the subject area. The other element of this is that every student in your class now has an opportunity to hear about this. And we start with the awareness raising because this is quite big and it can be overwhelming. And again, that Take One, start with one SDG, start with one that aligns to where you're at. So, for example, we see a learning outcome, and I appreciate the screen might be small for some. We have a learning outcome in modern foreign languages that talks about comparing and contrasting aspects of personal interest in the target language country with those in their own country. So there's lots of ways a teacher can engage with that. One example I will give you is where some of our teachers took the Paris Olympics as an opportunity to look at making comparisons between one country and another, looking at things like equality. One of the first times that we saw an Olympic Games have almost parity in terms of gender. So opportunities to make comparisons in relation to what that looked like. And again, leaning into the area that is a passion maybe for a teacher or an area that they care about. So if we have a teacher that looks or is really interested in gender equality, they can lean into that. If we have a teacher that wants to look at that quality education piece and inclusivity, looking at the full definition, there's opportunities to engage there also. The second example I've put on screen is a subject we call home economics, domestic science, very broad. You can see that the strands there look at food and health, responsible family living, and textiles and crafts. Again, we have strands, we have learning outcomes. Home economics is one of our more unusual subjects, and that sustainable development is very explicitly referenced throughout the learning outcomes. So we have things in and one like applying sustainable practices to the selection and management of food and material resources. How do we buy? How do we purchase? How do we bring foods? We're an island nation, looking at import, etc. What happens there? But also looking at things like food waste. Where does that go? How do we manage that? And you'll see some of the sustainable development goals I've highlighted there in terms of poverty, in terms of hunger, energy management, responsible consumption and production. And again, supporting teachers to make reference to what they look like and how that impacts. And also the climate piece. It's not that it gets disregarded, but really highlighting for our students that the climate piece and the sustainable development goals were never intended to be implemented as individual goals, but they were designed and devised as an interconnected piece of engagement, so that when I am being responsible in my consumption, that has an impact on the planet. It has an impact on energy. It has an impact on infrastructure. Worth mentioning another strand there, looking at 3.8 in textiles and crafts, discussing the influences of trends and choices on textile and clothing, including ethical and ecological considerations. That's the fast fashion piece. So again, it offers the teacher the opportunity to lean into that in a way that is comfortable for them, but highlighting the breadth of engagement and how all of these things are interconnected. So looking at that, that's the first, I suppose, piece of engagement for our teachers, is highlighting how they do have the expertise, they do have the comfort of knowing that this is very much about their professional experience and what that looks like. But of course, I'm very aware that providing resources only one part. How do I support those teachers then to put that into practice, to engage? And as I mentioned, there is one of these resources or these supports for every subject across the lower second level curriculum. In Ireland, currently, our upper second level curriculum is under a process of review. So that will come in the next stage, whereas our junior cycle or our lower second level has been reviewed. So it's very important that I can say to teachers, this aligns with what is very contemporary and current practice for you and works across the system. So the resources there for all of those subject areas. So how do we look at putting that into practice? Fortuitously for me, this invitation comes during what I call Take 1 Week, which is November 17th to 21st. The 21st has slightly disappeared there off screen. And Take 1 Week is a challenge issued to teachers. It asks them to look at the resource following training, and during the course of that week, to look at their timetable and find at any point across that timetable an opportunity to teach one lesson about any one SDG to any one of the classes on their timetable over the course of 1 week. The idea behind this is to take away that pressure of feeling like I have to talk about sustainability and sustainable development constantly, but instead to look at opportunities where it fits naturally. So if you will indulge me for a moment, I'm going to share a story of what that might look like within a school. And I'm very conscious again of how busy school environments are. So there's a One World Week in Ireland during this week, which aligns with Take 1 Week. But also I say to schools, sustainable development isn't about 1 week. So if you want to do this next week, or you want to do it in January, or you want to do it in March, or you want to align it with a well-being week, it's really important that you do this in a way that works for you. But again, that one lesson, one SDG, one class over the course of 1 week. So for example, if I'm a business studies teacher and I have a year 8 or a second year group or a group of 14-year-olds on my timetable that week, and I'm teaching them business, and I happen to be teaching as part of my planned content some information on the difference between minimum wage and living wage. I carry on teaching that. I don't pause my teaching. I don't have to find new information. But while I'm teaching that topic, I talk to my students about SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. and looking at why it's important that we know the difference between minimum wage and living wage. And it's very much highlights Ireland and Ireland's context. Again, there can be a tendency to look at development issues as an overseas issue, but really looking at what that looks like in the local context. So all of the students within that business class are hearing about minimum wage, living wage, and SDG 8. That cohort of students may travel to another classroom and they might end up in an engineering class or a woodwork class or a technology class. And that teacher is planned that week to teach them about house design, house planning, looking at energy management. In Ireland now we have legislation which no longer allows our houses to be built with open fireplaces. So how does that impact on design? How does that impact socially? Because we don't have the fireplace as that centerpiece to sit around. And again, that teacher can highlight things like SDG 9, industry, infrastructure, and innovation. Our house designs now change. We don't have a chimney anymore. How will that impact? But equally, we could look at SDG 7 and make reference to energy management. So again, just highlighting for students the things they learn, making connections between what they learn in the real world are relevant to sustainable development. That cohort of students disperses and they may go to an art class. That teacher may be looking at teaching a module on weaving as part of their natural curriculum plan. So again, not changing anything that's part of the plan, not feeling as a teacher like I have to pause something in an already busy timetable. And I may be looking at that weaving and talking about repurposing materials, using old pieces of clothing to weave, to create images, to create pictures, and talk to my students about SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. And I may get an opportunity to talk about fast fashion. But really interestingly, I also, as a teacher, might look at those students and think, I know that the reduce, reuse, recycle may not land yet again because we're all talking about it and it's difficult. So I might instead talk about how we use imagery to tell stories, and imagery and weaving is part of our culture and heritage. So lean in instead to that piece and look at that and talk about things like making connections with the west of Ireland, where we have our Aran jumpers and our patterns aligned to different family names and how they tell us something about our culture and our heritage. Make a comparison with Scotland, where we have kilt patterns who also make connections to family names. And again, looking at that international piece, SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, looking at the culture. So if you can imagine what your school would look like during that week, we have students in all the subjects across the curriculum, hearing teachers talk individually about sustainable development, not leaving their classrooms, but light bulb moments where that teacher spoke about sustainable development in French, but we heard about it in technology, we heard about it in art. The maths teacher speaks about it in terms of statistics and probability. And all of a sudden you have a whole school environment without a huge pivot talking about sustainability based on one lesson, on one SDG from one class over 1 week. Obviously, my aspiration is that it would grow beyond that, but it's really looking at that overwhelm that we can feel in terms of trying to embed something new and starting in areas where teachers can feel like, yeah, I can actually take this on board and what that looks like. The program provides all of the resource material for schools. We promote on social media. It started on Twitter and X when Twitter and X wasn't quite such a dark place, but you can have a look on the Take One program website and there's a gallery there and you can see some of examples of what the schools have done. We have, obviously, Irish is our national language as well as English, so all of the resources and supports are presented to schools in Irish and in English. And you'll notice none of the posters or the materials has a date on it, so that if a school does wish to take 1 week in March or in September, They don't feel like all of these materials have a date on them or a year on them. And I don't panic so much if they need to print things off. It's really important that we have a visual cue for all of our learners and to look at what that looks like. So you can see what it might look like in a school environment. I've put up some examples on screen to highlight the kinds of things that schools have been doing. And this is just a very, very small flavour given the time we have. I mentioned that mantra, every student, every subject, every class. And one of the things I'm most proud about for the Take One programme is that it adheres to that mantra. We have an opportunity in Ireland for our students who may have additional needs to engage in an adjusted curriculum, which provides a lot of supports for them, which offers them smaller classroom environments depending on what extra supports they may need. And we call that an L1 and an L2 programme, One Learning 2. And the image on the top left-hand corner on the screen there is from a school with who had one of those programs. And that cohort of students grew herbs in the school garden. They harvested those herbs. They made some scones or scones, depending on the part of the world you're in, as part of a healthy breakfast, healthy eating. So their learning unit was on personal care, and they focused on SDG 3, good health and well-being. And that cohort of students can participate in Take One because their learning aligns to their learning outcome. So there's no sense in that school environment that, oh, this class group is doing more because they're better able, or this class group can't engage because they need additional supports. And again, that values piece, we're all in this, the community piece, so we all engage. An example from the top right-hand corner, that home economics classroom, and that teacher making comparisons between natural stain removers and shop-bought stain removers. So again, demonstrating the learning embedded as part of the curriculum and the subject syllabus content. And then another example of what we do in the Take One programme is a bit of celebration and look at positivity. In education, we have a tendency, certainly in Ireland, to look at what we're not doing. So I try and encourage teachers to celebrate their achievements and what we're doing well. And that aspiration of the not doing it really comes from a place of trying to do better. So in May of every year, I throw out a challenge for schools to create a metre of meadow. And that means finding a green area within a school and not mowing it, not interfering with it, let it grow. Let's see what natural species come up. No throwing out of seed bombs. Let the weeds thrive, let the sedums appear, let the dandelions appear. And then look at what appears after that. Do we see some bees? Do we see some butterflies? Do we see some natural environments? And the metre idea just acknowledges that some of our schools are urban and they may not have as much green space as everywhere else. But my Twitter /X feed for that day, that week, again, is superb because it's so fundamentally green. It's wonderful to see what happens in relation to that. So it's just a really nice experience to look at what happens in terms of when we let things happen and when we let things grow and what that looks like, and supporting schools to engage in whatever way they can. That May Day for sustainability does happen and will happen on the 6th of May in 2026. But like all of the other pieces that I've mentioned, I'm very happy for schools to say, listen, we're going to do it in March and have a March for sustainability. Sustainable development can't just succeed when we pause things or when we have it during a week. So while it's important for me to encourage students to have that week or have those days and schools, it's also important to acknowledge it can happen whenever it happens, and that's really useful. Just a few kind of concluding slides to make reference, and I see there's some comments, so hopefully I'll be able to address those. Just some links on that slide in relation to other pieces of work where I have presented this programme. I have presented it at the World Environmental Education Conferences in Budapest and in Abu Dhabi. It is presented as an example by the OECD as a global teaching insights, an example of sustainability in action. I've recently just done a piece in relation to global citizenship education, and I do understand the challenge in relation to the language around this. So that's my current piece of research, looking at how do teachers understand sustainable development, and does that understanding impact how they engage with it? So really looking to inform that. And as I mentioned to you, some links from various policy documents that I referenced, should you feel the need to have a look. But I always say I'm big on community, I'm big on conversation. Absolutely 100% reach out to me. I'm very keen to grow this program and share it outside of Ireland. And I will say, if you are operating in an environment that has a learning outcome, the Take One program will work for you, because that's where it maps into. Again, there are some slides at the end in relation to how you can connect with this, but there's the Twitter feed, Blue Sky Social, and the takeoneprogram.com, and your capacity to contact me at takeoneprogram@outlook.com. Just looking at some comments here. Yeah, there's a comment here on the systematic approach to teaching and learning for sustainable development. I think it's really, really important to lean into what we have to do. I listened to some of the presentations yesterday, and particularly Howard's on curriculum. And I do feel that frustration, and I don't want to present some kind of utopian perfect scenario in Ireland. But it's certainly useful for me to stand in front of educators and say, it's there. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is the practice running through? It's not. And the biggest tension is, do we mandate this? How do you encourage people to engage in a way that they see it makes sense, without having to take the stick approach and say, you must do this? So again, that's why I really lean into that broad interpretation of sustainable development. And again, if I can present a visual, I liken sustainable development. I'm very much informed by Howard Gardner's work and Project Zero and Teaching for Understanding, and looking at sustainable development in the middle of a room. And the 17 sustainable development goals are like doors. You come in through whatever door is of value to you. Hopefully you'll look at coming through other doors. But if I feel really, really strongly about a poverty, then I can use that as my access point to sustainable development. In a country like Ireland, where we're considered a wealthy nation, we still have a lot of young people living in consistent poverty, 250,000 of them. If I'm living in consistent poverty, plastic in the ocean is not my primary concern. The climate is not my primary concern. And poverty impacts hunger, and hunger impacts my capacity to go to school. If I don't have capacity to go to school, that impacts my health and well-being, but it also impacts my journey beyond school, where I work, what further education and training I have, what kind of job I might take on board, what kind of qualification. And that informs who I am as a consumer. So SDG 8, SDG 12, and all of that impacts climate. So that's why I really look at that interconnected piece, that interdisciplinary piece. Every thread we pull impacts something else. And it's really important where somebody is overwhelmed by the climate piece. And it upsets me to think anybody has anxiety about this, that panics about it, crisis, but the language we use aligned to it is not helpful. So really looking at what can I do and what's important to me? And if my garden is important to me, then that's where we look at it. So looking at various bits and pieces. I'm just looking at some of the comments there. Yeah, the terminology is difficult. I've kind of moved a little bit away from ESD, and I just talk about the SD piece. Because again, I think there's a danger when we say ESD, that it's education for sustainable development as a subject or a thing. So I look at sustainable development, and the E is kind of like a small e. But I could write a whole thesis on how we interpret the language and how we interpret sustainability. But I just feel, oh, let's get at it, come at it from wherever you think you're comfortable to start, and look at that piece. I do hope that I will look at the senior cycle or our upper second level piece in due course. As I said, we're in the midst of lots of research conferences here in Ireland at the moment, and we have a convention in terms of what that will look like. And again, nothing that is unusual across the world. What is education for? Is it about the world of work? Is it about progress? Is it about supporting better citizenship and what that looks like? And we could debate and argue, I think ad nauseum for that in relation and to what it is. Thank you, Lucy. You've put up a link to the UN SDGs. I forget sometimes that people may or may not know what they are. Certainly in Ireland, there are times when we feel we've done that. We don't need to look at it anymore. But I think for me, the awareness raising thing will always be very, very important, and looking at that. So I think from my perspective, I hope that's given you a sense of that's given you a sense of the take-home program, connections to other countries in Europe or other countries as far along in Ireland. I don't think so. I think it's funny in countries, because I've traveled, I've had an opportunity to make some comparisons. I know certainly there are European countries that I've worked in that we can't mention language like democracy or human rights. We're very lucky in Ireland. We can have those conversations and have those disagreements, and debate and discuss those issues. And I think one of the gems about sustainable development is that critical thinking piece. We don't need to have an answer. We do not need to have an answer, but we do need to debate and talk and figure out, how do I ask you about something that's contentious? How do we discuss it and maybe agree to disagree and say, you know what, have at it with the planet. I'm not buying an electric car. It's $50,000 and I can't afford it. And I like my fire. But that we think, and that we look at that. Interestingly as well, in terms of other countries, and I think the US might be similar. I know in Germany there are federal states, and each of those have oversight of their curriculum. So it can be a little bit more difficult in terms of trying to streamline that in. And as I said, I heard Howard's piece yesterday, and if there's a positive on a national curriculum, it means that work like mine, I don't have to worry about in the north of the country or in different counties or different jurisdictions. So that's kind of useful. But listen, we all know for everything that you say is great, somebody will have a challenge with that. And I think, for me, that's the interesting space. Let's have good, gnarly debate. And if we do that with integrity, isn't that fabulous? It's not about reaching some kind of brilliant conclusion about you're right, I'm wrong. This works, this doesn't, because this is a movable piece, and I think that's what makes it quite interesting. So yeah, absolutely. And if there's anybody out there across the globe that thinks there might be an opportunity, even in a take one step way, I would love to connect and love to see, could this be repurposed? Are there ways of helping people, and I'm glass half full, glass fully full. Let's see what we can do.
Yeah, it's very, in the United States, we've had a reluctance to actually adopt practices from other outside the US, I guess. We always look at Finland in education, saying how wonderful Finland is with their progressive practices. But in reality, at scale, at least, adopting their innovations or their way of teaching is not necessarily translated. And so we're really, we put some countries on a pedestal in education, and but at the same time, we're all over the place because we're so big, because we are there's no national curriculum, as you mentioned, and we're trying to do so much in general. And I think we've been behind on the ESD part, and there's confusion about what to call things. We've traditionally not said global citizenship. We've moved towards global competence, but not everybody knows what that means. And so, more conversations with educators about this and how it impacts and how it can be done in an integrated manner, like you've described, is really important. And it's distressing to me that it's not more of a priority. And I don't think it's going to be more of a priority in the next 3 years for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
The other observation before I shut up is, we've had I've gone to a couple of the GENE conferences, the Global Education Network of Europe, which is run by an Irishman, and their core philosophy is very progressive and peace and social justice and youth oriented. And this seems very much in line. That seems very much part of the Irish ethos, maybe. And so that's really super interesting to me. And I think I would love to hear your thoughts on how youth are responding to this. You've been doing this for what, 5 years now? And
Yes,
do you have any research or anything that talks about, how youth are impacted by this? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it just to circle back to a couple of points. I'm a big fan of Pasi Sahlberg, but he himself would say, "Stop looking to us. We this worked for us. Stop trying to pick up bits of this." And I think we forget as well that the innovations in Finland were 17 years in the making. They went right back to zero. And we can look at things from the outside in and pick them up and say, oh, as you said, even in the US, how do we apply this? And sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good. We can spend a lot of time trying to decide, what do we call this? And then suddenly realize we've spent so much time deciding what to call it. We've done none of it, We would have a very, very strong youth piece in Ireland. I think there's a spectrum, certainly, and my concern about the youth voice piece for me, and this is very much a personal opinion, is we have some exceptionally competent and confident young people who speak about this, who represent young people, but I worry they're not representative of young people. So I think of those kids that are, from my teaching experience, really articulate when they're talking to me, but they will never be on the student council. They will never be on a soapbox. They will never go and march, but they will be really strong personally. They may be very individual in their engagement and action. And I worry about that a little bit, that and I would say it of adults as well, that the radio voice, or the person who picks up the phone to talk very strongly about things, is the voice that sometimes gets all the traction because they have the competence or the capacity to do that. And I think it's really important that we don't misinterpret silence for compliance. I know in my own work, people will nod sagely and say, oh, sustainable development is really, really important, but I won't have changed any minds. And I think it's really important to value that. That's really important to think about. How can I help people to even think, even if there isn't capacity to change? Because rather interestingly, in Ireland, the people who are living most sustainably are also the people who are living with most disadvantage. They're the people who can't afford to turn on the electricity and the heating in their houses. They're not driving cars because they can't afford to. Their diet in terms of what they can purchase. So that's interesting to me that you can have that and I don't think that's unusual the world over, because if I'm living under straitened circumstances, I don't have the consumer choices that maybe somebody who has change in their pocket does. But they're not seeing it like that. They're not seeing that, oh, I'm being sustainable by not turning on the heating. It's a pragmatic thing. And I think we need to tap into that a little bit more. And particularly, as I said, I'm mindful of Ireland being one of the wealthier nations in Europe, if not in the world. And yet we have this piece where you have 250,000 of our young people living in consistent poverty. So, we need to be careful that we don't look at this is on our doorstep, and because we don't see it or talk about it. But yes, we would have a very strong, as I said, the ESD strategy acknowledges the youth piece. So we've a lot of strong youth groups, young people. But likewise, my doctoral research at the moment is also highlighting that piece of, can you stop talking about it? So again, there's a cohort that are thinking, we have spoken about this so much and haven't progressed it. Let's move on to the next thing. Yeah, and translating that into action, so it's I mean, gosh, it's complex. It can be easier to ignore because it's so hard and it's gnarly, but we've lots of groups represented and the youth voice is strong, but how that's translating into practice, and more importantly, how is that translating into those youth in their adult experience? Is that creating? And again, that's not about saying I promise, haven't tried to kill the planet. I haven't tried to ruin it for the people coming after me. I do feel really strongly about that. But likewise, I'm not suggesting that those young people are going to fix all of this. It's daunting. It's overwhelming. But I think we need to keep talking. And I'm a big fan of try something, do something rather than and be paralyzed, So
rather than do nothing.
So that's interesting as well.
Thank you, Valerie. This has been really insightful. And I think this is some really good guidance for what, wherever you are in the world, how curriculum can look and how initiatives can look in terms of structure. I love the idea of having an ESD week. Traditionally, this is International Education Week here, at least. I don't think our government's doing very much for it this year, but I think there's a lot to take away from here, and understanding how ESD is much more than climate. That's another takeaway for me too. So we need to move on to our next set of sessions, but I want to thank you for being here and being so flexible. And at least you're not getting up at 6 a.m. in Ireland. But I hope people watch the recording because I think this is incredibly valuable. Thank you. And for those of you watching, we have another set of sessions going for the next hour. Some are starting at the top of the hour, some are starting at the halfway point. Make sure to jump in and support our speakers. And thank you for being here. And we'll see you in the next set of rooms, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.